So in this particular lecture, let's learn how we could calculate the sum of the total amount which is being spent up over here. So right now we have all the expenses, and let's say we want to calculate the total of those expenses and display it up over here inside the table. Now, one way to do this is you could actually implement this using JavaScript. So in JavaScript, you could get access to the elements by their IDs or something like that, and then just sum these values up and then display the sum up over here. But another way to do this would be to go ahead and do this on the back end, that is, do this inside Django itself. So let's learn how exactly we could implement that. So I'll go back here to VS Code and I will go to the views which is rendering this particular table right here. So the view responsible for this is index view, and inside this particular view, now we need to calculate the sum of the total of all the expenses. So the way in which we do that is we first go ahead and take all the expenses or the expense objects, and once we have those particular expense objects, what we do is that we simply try to calculate the sum of them. So here we already have the expense objects and we have passed those particular expense objects as expenses as context here. Now, in order to get the sum, what I would do is that I would say something like total expenses equals, and this is actually going to go ahead, take all the objects which is expenses, and after getting the expenses, we are going to aggregate them. And by aggregation, we mean that we take all of them together. So we say expenses dot aggregate, and then we say that after aggregating those expense objects, we want to calculate the sum of those expenses. So I would say sum and then pass in an amount here. So once this thing is done, we are pretty much good to go, and this actually calculates the sum of all the expenses here. Now we have the sum of expenses saved in total expenses, and our job now is to simply go ahead and pass those particular expenses here. But even before passing those expenses, let's actually try printing up the value of the total expenses and see the kind of result we would get. So here I would simply print up the total expenses, and now let's go back to the browser. And now let's make a fresh GET request to this so that the print statement is actually triggered. Okay, so we got an error here which says that sum is not defined. Okay, so as we have used sum over there, we actually need to import sum. So sum is actually a method which is present inside the Django models. So we need to import that up over here. So I need to say from django.db.models. So as we are performing the summation on the database values, we need to import the sum method from there. So we actually forgot to do that. And as soon as you do that, hit refresh. Now this page is rendered and the print method would be triggered as well. So if you actually go to the terminal here, as we are actually printing up the total expenses, the total expenses object gave us this result. So in that particular object, we have this value which is called as amount sum. That means the total amount sum it's displaying is 1333. So if you actually go back here and if you try to calculate the sum of these values, that's obviously the correct answer. So that means it's working fine, and that means we simply have to pass in the total expenses here. So I would give a comma and also pass in total expenses as total expenses here. And once we have passed that thing in, I would go inside the index, and let's say you want to display that up over here right after this cell. That is when all the rows are actually completed. So for that, we go right where the for ends. So the for actually ends here. And right after the for ends, we will display the total. So here I would say something like displaying total. Let's get that, paste it up over here. And in there, I will actually create a span tag to display that. I will say that the class of this thing is going to be font bold. And I want to show it in a green color. So text green with a shade of, let's say, 500. And to display the actual amount, I would display the actual amount in template syntax. And I would say total underscore expenses dot. And here inside total expenses, we actually want to get the value which is amount sum. So in there, I would say amount double underscore sum. Okay, so now if I go back here, hit refresh, as you can see that value is being displayed up over here, and I actually want to display it right up over here. And in order to do that, I will actually create a div here and get this entire span and place it inside that div. So I'll cut it from here, paste it up over here. And then I would say that the class of this thing is going to be px72, which adds a padding of 72. And we also want to add some padding from the top as well. So py equals 5. And hopefully that should align it over here. So it aligned it kind of over here. If you want to give more padding, you could make it something like 80. And here I could also add some text which says something like total. Okay. So it's not aligned properly. We are going to fix that later, obviously. But for now, we get the sum here, and that's exactly what we want. Now, one more thing that could be done here is that you could actually add a dollar sign to this sum so that this sum looks more natural in its own unit. So we could add a dollar sign here, and we could also add dollar signs to these sum values as well, which we have. So right now, these are just showing up simple values without any currency. So let's add currency to them as well. So in here, I would say dollar and then the actual amount. So this is what it looks like. And one more thing that could be done here is that now let's say you have this amount here and you don't have any kind of commas. So if the value is bigger, it actually becomes unreadable or difficult to use. Therefore, what we could do is that we could add commas right where we actually require them. So now the question is, how exactly would you add those commas? What kind of code you would write? Now, the best thing about Django is that it actually comes in with a library, and that library actually helps us to automatically add commas to the numerical values which we have. So we are going to learn how to implement that in the next lecture. So thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Thank you.